Good afternoon, and thank you for connecting with the Pennsylvania Game Commission today. My name is Lori, and my colleague Brittany and I will be managing the session today. We are fortunate to be joined by Matt Lovallo, Game Mammal Section Supervisor for the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and he'll be speaking with us today about the elusive fisher in Pennsylvania. I'd like to do a quick audio check to make sure everyone can hear me. If you'll check the control panel to the right of your screen and send some text to from the type question here box, we'll begin when we have confirmation that the audio is working. While you're doing that, I can let you know that we expect the presentation to last about 20 minutes, followed by a question and answer period of about 10 to 15 minutes. For those of you dialing in to listen by phone today, please note that this is not a toll-free call, and you may receive long-distance charges from your service provider. You'll also see in the handouts section there are some notes pages from the PowerPoint that you'll see today, and there's also a copy of the wildlife note on fishers that you can use for reference at a later time. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Lovallo. Thanks for joining us today, Matt.
Thank you, Lori. Well, of all the fur bearer species that we manage here in the Commonwealth, I think there's probably more misinformation and misconceptions about the fisher than many of the other species that we have here in the Keystone State. And so my goal today is to share with you some of the information we have concerning the history, the reintroduction, and the population management of fisher populations in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Historically, we know from the fossil record that fishers once extended as far south as Tennessee and North Carolina, but in recent centuries their range was restricted to more northern latitudes, including Pennsylvania. We know from early trapper reports and fur records and colonial observations that fisher were widespread in the late 1700s, early 1800s throughout all of the forests of Pennsylvania. But we know that by the mid-1800s, around 1850, their population started to decline. You know, as we moved through Pennsylvania and systematically cleared our old-growth virgin stands of forest, many species of forest wildlife were impacted, some more dramatically than others. But certainly this deforestation caused a dramatic decline in our fisher population. We know that fisher were extirpated throughout much of the state by the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the last known confirmed fisher was trapped in Lancaster County, of all places. We lost fisher, we lost beaver, we lost elk, mountain lions, and many other species. Most of those have been restored through sound wildlife management practices and reintroduction efforts. Some may never be restored. As we moved into the 1900s, and I'd say about the 1960s or 1970s, there appeared to be kind of a change in public perception about the values and roles of predators in forest ecosystems. And many states throughout the Northeast started to ask the question as to whether or not they could reintroduce and restore their lost fisher populations. Of course, the initial questions were, you know, what would be suitable habitat for a reintroduction effort? And as they looked back through the historic records and observations, it appeared that fisher were most often trapped in mature stands of often coniferous forest, large tracts of hemlock and other mature forest stands. And they realized that many of those habitat components just weren't readily available. Certainly the forest had matured, but we didn't have those expansive tracts of old growth timber where fisher once were found. As those reintroductions moved forward and were successful again and again throughout the Northeast, it became apparent that fisher were much more of a generalist carnivore than we had once thought. They didn't need very specific habitat requirements, and in fact fisher are currently found in a wide variety of habitats, including our mixed hardwood stands and mixed oak stands here in Pennsylvania of various age classes. What we've learned through habitat studies is that it may not be as important what's in the canopy in terms of tree species composition as what's on the forest floor. And we've learned that dense understories, and particularly an abundance of coarse woody debris, are important and valuable for fisher populations, primarily because they support a diverse and abundant population or community of small mammals, which are a food base for fisher and many other forest predators. So let's take a quick look at fisher biology. You know, one of the most common questions we get through our public website is basic information or basic questions about an animal that they've just seen, and often the caption is, "What is this animal?" And it turns out to be a fisher. A fisher is a member of the weasel family. It's the second largest member of the mustelid family that we have here in Pennsylvania, second only to river otters. For comparison's sake, they're about the size of a large house cat. Males are significantly larger than females and may reach up to about 15 pounds, whereas females are typically in the 7 to 9 pound range. Fisher are not aquatic. They don't necessarily eat fish, although they can swim. And we believe the name fisher was derived from the fact that when early colonial settlers first moved into the eastern part of this country and saw these animals for the first time, they were reminded of a European polecat named the fichette, and that became the basis for the current terminology of fisher. They're sometimes called fisher cats in some of the other northeastern states, but they're not related to felids in any way. They're unique among other predators here in Pennsylvania in terms of their reproductive ecology and their reproductive schedule. Each year here in Pennsylvania, typically in late March or early April, females will give birth to up to 6 kits, usually high in a treetop in a cavity with a very narrow opening. And what's interesting is that about 7 to 10 days after parturition or after giving birth, they'll come into estrus and will be and can mate again. And if that is successful and an egg is fertilized, it's actually free floating in the uterus. There's no embryonic development until next February, when it implants into the uterine wall and gestation begins. And this system is called delayed implantation, and it's a reproductive strategy that allows male fisher to expend a lot of energy trying to breed with female fisher at a time of year when prey resources are very abundant. There's a lot of small mammals and birds being born at that time of year, and so they have an abundant prey source to meet their energetic demands. Fisher have a very high metabolism. They're active all year. From our radiotelemetry studies, we know that even in the coldest winter conditions, they're out foraging, often during daylight hours. So they have to forage extensively to meet their metabolic demands. And if these fisher were having to expend a lot of energy in February to mate and to produce offspring, that would be energetically demanding. If we had to describe a fisher as a predator, I'd say they're opportunistic, they're highly adaptable and highly efficient foragers that utilize a very diverse variety of prey. And one of the contributing factors to this is that unlike many of the predators that they compete with, such as coyotes or bobcats, fishers are very efficient at foraging not only on the forest floor, but also in the treetops, where they can predate on nestling birds and nesting squirrels, and even utilize soft mass, such as cherries. This is a cherry tree in this video, and we were actually able to observe that fisher eating cherries soon after it was released in this research study. Fisher are renowned for their ability, unique adaptive ability to predate on porcupines. And though in many cases, I think the impact of fisher populations on porcupine populations is really overestimated. Some of the early reintroduction efforts were justified under the notion that fisher would become a biological control for porcupines, and that really hasn't been realized. I don't think there's any good empirical evidence that fisher can suppress a porcupine population, but we do know from our diet studies that they do predate on porcupines, perhaps more so than other forest carnivores. Recently, Dr. Jeff Larkin at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania completed some diet studies where they looked at the stomach contents of a large sample of fisher. These were fisher that we provided to them largely from roadkills or other mortality events. So they were collected throughout the year over a period of time. And what you can see from this is a very diverse diet. This is more food, more different taxa, if you will, or prey species or food items than we see when we look at the diets of other species such as coyote or bobcat. Everything from bats and insects to squirrels and small mammals, as you might expect. And very interestingly, they detected a large number of fisher who had other fisher parts in their stomachs, suggesting cannibalism among fisher. Now, whether that's directly predated fisher or scavenged fisher, we don't know, but it was very apparent that that there were large parts of other fisher consumed. In many cases, these parts were actually toes and other parts of feet from other fisher, which is interesting in its own right. One of the challenges for wildlife managers is to balance the impacts of growing populations on other species of wildlife. You know, our hunters and trappers here in the Commonwealth are often concerned that a growing fisher population could impact their opportunities to hunt squirrels or other small mammals. But given the diverse diet that we've seen, it's unlikely that they'll have any large impact on one prey species in particular. But there are some concerns out there. For example, in the Midwest, there's some pretty good evidence that as their fisher populations increase, bobcat populations began to decline, and that may have been due to direct predation on juvenile bobcats or kittens, or it could be interspecific competition suppressing their bobcat populations. There was recently a study on goshawk nesting ecology in Michigan, which documented very high rates of nestling predation by fisher actually coming into the nest and taking those nestlings at very high numbers. And so there is a challenge and some impacts that we have to work to weigh against one another as we manage all of these species. As we look at where population in Pennsylvania has gone, we have to realize that it's come from two source populations. One of the first states to begin reintroducing fisher was West Virginia, and they began their reintroductions in 1969. It was a very small effort. I think it was about 23 fisher that were reintroduced in 2 sites in West Virginia. Since that reintroduction, those fisher have expanded throughout West Virginia, Western Maryland, have now made their way down into Northern Virginia, and at some point in the mid-90s, 1990s, began to expand into southwestern Pennsylvania through the Laurel Highlands. So that was a natural expansion from a reintroduced population in West Virginia. What's more significant is that in the mid to late 1990s, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, in cooperation with the Wild Resource Conservation Fund and Department of Conservation and Natural Resources and the Pennsylvania State University, conducted a highly effective, well-organized, and highly successful reintroduction effort where, in fact, 190 fisher were reintroduced across sites throughout northern Pennsylvania. These fisher were trapped and transported into Pennsylvania from New York and New Hampshire, were held in captivity, monitored for condition, and subsequently released in very good condition. So it was a very successful effort, and again, the success was due to that partnership among these various entities. What's interesting is that because so few fisher were reintroduced into West Virginia, they have a very unique genetic structure. And what we found is that as we go through Pennsylvania and we collect road-killed fisher or fisher samples from our harvested population each year, we can actually genetically tell where that fisher, the lineage of that fisher, where it came from. In other words, did it originate from that West Virginia population, or was it one we reintroduced or came from New York somehow? And the green points in this map are all fisher samples that Dr. Larkin, again at IUP, has collected that were attributed to the West Virginia population. You can see that population expansion extends almost up into central Pennsylvania now, but certainly is most dominant in the Laurel Highlands. The blue dots are dots that where fisher probably, in terms of their lineage, originated from that reintroduction effort, and we have mixing of those populations throughout the range. We use a variety of population indices to monitor changes in our fisher population, both numerically and geographically. And really all of the indices we use, and these bars on this graph actually represent unsolicited observations to our wildlife conservation officers each year. These are incidents where a person, a hunter or a citizen, comes up to an officer and says, hey, I just saw this animal, or I saw a fisher, or have a picture of a fisher on a trail camera. So these are unsolicited reports that have come in. And all of the indices tell us that our population really began to take off in the early 2000s, and all suggest about 2003 was a starting point of a pretty dramatic increase in fisher populations. So here we have unsolicited reports to our conservation officers. And it's interesting to note that these increases have continued even after we began our first regulated fisher trapping season began in 2010. In this case, the red line represents numbers of fisher that are incidentally caught by trappers in traps set for raccoons or fox or other species and subsequently released outside of the current fisher harvest season. So these are fisher that are caught and released each year. Again, you can see those numbers really took off in the early 2000s and are continuing to increase to this day. We're constantly receiving pictures through our public website and other means of fishers showing up in new places. And I think it's safe to say that with the increases we're seeing, virtually each and every day, someone somewhere in Pennsylvania is seeing their first fisher in their lifetime. And so it's a pretty exciting time. And so we get pictures off of people's back porches. We get pictures of people hiking through the woods. In this case, on the far right is a fisher, a pair of fisher, which is unique. Typically they're solitary, but a fisher and a parent juvenile where a person took the picture hiking in the winter months. Each year, as hunters start deploying hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of trail cameras throughout the forests of Pennsylvania, we're inundated with pictures of fisher, often from places, new places within their range in the state. They often come with the caption, "What is this animal?" And before even opening the picture, we often know it's going to be a fisher because it's such a common occurrence. So when we talk about that increase in our fisher population, it's not just an increase in density in a given area, it's also due to a geographic increase. And particularly since 2008, we've seen a pretty dramatic expansion of fisher range in Pennsylvania. In the next series of maps, the light green to green polygons indicate areas where we have stable to increasing populations. Some of the voids in that distribution are due to a lack of data points, but you can see we had a fairly consistent distribution across the northern tier down into the southwest region of the state. As we jump forward a few years into 2011, you can see a lot of expansion in the northwest region as well as the south, moving towards some of the southeastern counties. And more recently, in 2015, we're getting very close to having a truly ubiquitous fisher distribution in probably all forested habitats throughout Pennsylvania. One of the challenging aspects of this expansion is that we know from our neighboring states that are a little further ahead of us in terms of the expansion of their fisher population, that fisher are certainly begin to utilize suburban woodlot type habitats more and more. And as they get into these habitats and establish themselves, the potential for conflicts becomes greater. The most common conflicts that we hear about are fisher at bird feeders causing problems, or fisher actually predating particularly on domestic cats. And so that can be a challenging issue to address because in many of those environments we just don't have the management tools necessary to deal with the growing fisher population. We currently have in Pennsylvania the most conservative fisher trapping season anywhere in North America. It's a very limited season in terms of its duration and bag limit, the number of fisher you can trap. So if a person is interested in trapping a fisher in Pennsylvania, they're first required to purchase a fur taker's license. Secondly, they have to purchase a fisher trapping permit. And most importantly, if they're successful, they're required to report a fisher harvest within 48 hours using a variety of methods that are provided to them. Again, this season has been in place consistently since 2010. And as we look at what's happened with the fisher harvest since 2010, we see that the harvest has increased, but it's important to note that that increase in harvest has been due to the fact that we've continually evaluating which management units, which wildlife management units we can allow fisher trapping in each year, and the number of units has been increasing each year since that season began in 2010. Last year in 2015, trappers harvested 401 fisher. We issued over 6,500 permits, and so you can see at the bottom of this table that they're averaging about a little over 6 fisher per 100 permits, and that's kind of a crude measure of harvest per unit effort that we can use to suggest that this current fisher harvest is having very little to no impact on the continued growth of our fisher population. Our upcoming fisher trapping season will begin December 18th. It will run through December 28th. It again allows a successful trapper to take one fisher from within one of the 13 wildlife management units which are currently open to harvest. And that's all I have for you today, but if you're interested in learning more about fisher biology and management in Pennsylvania, you can reference our fisher management plan, which is available on our public website. And with that, I'd be happy to address any questions that any of you may have.
Well, while we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, what should people do if they do see a fisher? Would they report it? Should they report it?
Yes, yeah, we do encourage people to report fisher sightings to us through our comments page on our general website, our public website. We're particularly interested in fisher showing up in new places. For example, a couple of years ago, we had some reports come in from some very small woodlot down in Dillsburg, Pennsylvania, which is not where we expected to hear about a growing fisher population, but that population has sustained itself and is doing very well. So we are interested in new sightings or first sightings, particularly when they occur outside of the core range of fisher population in Pennsylvania.
All right. Cole has a question. He'd like to know what kinds of immobilization techniques do you use to capture fishers for telemetry studies?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. In terms of capturing fisher, we recently had a study down in Cambria County around the Blue Knob State Park area where we caught a large sample of fisher. We caught those fisher simply in cage traps during the summer months, and we didn't even use bait. We just had a commercial lure on a rag in the back of the traps and had very good success. Once they're caught in a cage trap, they're immobilized with the usual drugs that we use to work with those animals. Typically ketamine or telazol, those types of mixtures are used to immobilize the animal. Excuse me.
All right, let's see. Tyler would like to know, do we have a total population estimate statewide?
Yeah, like most of the fur bearers that we manage, we do not have a total population estimate. To get such an estimate would be very costly and would just be a snapshot in time of a population we know is going to continue to grow. So it's much more important for us to monitor those changes using a variety of indices, such as the incidental captures by trappers that are reported to us each year on a fur taker survey.
Andrew is curious about plans for future fisher research in the near future.
Yeah, you know, of all of the areas of fisher ecology, I think biologists throughout the Northeast as a whole probably know less about the social structure and social dynamics of fisher populations than any other species. You know, as I mentioned during the presentation, they're thought to be, it's thought that those juveniles are really intolerant of other fisher and other litter mates by about 5 or 6 months of age and strike out on their own. And yet we continue to get reports in Pennsylvania of what appear to be family groups of fisher, 2 or 3 animals at a time together into the winter months and early spring months. And that's just not supposed to happen based on some of the literature that's out there. So there's a lot that we could understand better about the social dynamic, social structure of fisher population.
Rory would like to know what the average life expectancy is.
You know, in harvested samples, we see fisher living out to 6, 7 years of age. I believe in captivity, they've lived much longer in zoo-type situations, but I don't know that we have much more information beyond that.
Okay. Do we know if there is any raptor nestling predation in Pennsylvania?
I'm sure there is some predation. The impact of that predation is probably unknown, although I have heard from ornithologists and birders throughout the states that they also have concerns, particularly about goshawk populations, which seem to be declining here in the Commonwealth, and the potential impact of fisher predation on those goshawks. So that is an area of interest and potentially concern.
Is there a reason that the goshawks more than other raptors?
No, I don't know. I can't specifically address the, you know, what the relative predation rates would be on those other raptors. I can just say that I think there's more concern over the declining goshawk populations than other species.
Sure. Mackenzie is curious about the home range.
Okay, good
size
question.
Of the home range.
Yep, we know that that home range size really varies with fisher density. So if you have more fisher in an area, they typically will have larger home ranges to get the resources they need. From the studies that we conducted down in Cambria County, and that would be considered a very high density population. In fact, as that literature is currently being published, it'll probably be the highest density ever reported in the Northeastern United States. Home ranges in that study area, females occupied home ranges of about 4.5 square miles. Males were much larger, about 13 square miles. Male home ranges overlapped extensively with other males and females, whereas females maintained more exclusive home range areas.
Robert is curious about the type of paws or claws they have. Are there any unique features?
Well, their track is fairly unique. It's kind of hard for me to describe verbally, but you can look it up. It's a very distinctive toe pattern, if you will, on the track, and the claws are semi-retractable, so you may or may not see claw marks in the mud or in the snow if you see a set of Fisher tracks. But they have a very unique track, and they also have a very unique gait. They can often, instead of walking, they'll often kind of hop through the forest or lope through the forest, somewhat like a wolverine. And so, like other mustelids, you'll see a pattern of tracks that are just side by side instead of staggered like a walking coyote.
Let's see, we have a question about what's the best way to safely release a fisher from a foothold trap?
Okay, that's a good question, and we do have more and more fisher being caught incidentally out of season and subsequently released. And, despite, I think, one of the misconceptions out there is that these fisher are simply small wolverine, and they're very vicious and ferocious. And in our experience handling these animals, they're really no more difficult to handle or release from a foothold trap than, say, a raccoon. The best way to restrain the animals would be to use a catch pole, that is a looped pole, and it's best to try and put the loop over the shoulder that's not in the trap, over the head and shoulder of the animal rather than just around the neck to reduce that animal.
We have a couple questions about rabies and fishers.
Okay, well, like most mammals, fisher are a vector species for rabies. We continue to battle raccoon strain rabies throughout the Commonwealth, particularly in the western part of the Commonwealth. And as we saw from the distribution maps, fisher populations are really expanding into the northwest and west, where we have a lot of raccoon rabies prevalent in those populations. I can tell you that it occurs in fisher in Pennsylvania. We did have one of our study animals in that Cambria County study actually die from rabies exposure.
Are there predators or other limiting factors?
Well, we don't believe habitat is as much a limiting factor as we once thought. There's really no significant avian predators on fisher here in the Midwest and other places where they have wolves. Wolves can be a significant predator on fisher, and I suspect coyotes could try and predate fisher here. But again, given the tree climbing ability of fisher, it'd be a unique situation where a coyote could actually catch a fisher and predate upon it. So the most significant cause of mortality throughout the range in the Northeast is human caused.
We got some more disease type questions. Vectors for ticks or mange?
I'm not aware of any cases of mange in fisher in our population here in Pennsylvania. As you probably know, we have a lot of mange in our black bear population. But I assume with fisher, they could contract the mites, as could us or anybody else. And but whether it would be a prevalent problem, I really can't say.
Let's see what else we have here. Any evidence of fisher eating wild turkey?
Yeah, that's a common concern we hear from hunters. I think the perception is that because fisher can climb trees and hunt in trees, that when turkeys go to roost, they'll be vulnerable at night to a fisher. And all I can really say to address that is that in our diet studies, birds were not very prevalent at all in the diet, and that's all birds, including nestlings and grouse and other species which they undoubtedly do predate upon. So we haven't seen a lot of evidence in our diet studies or our research studies that they're really focusing in on turkeys. And again, I think it comes back to this diverse diet that they have. They're opportunistic, and while it certainly can occur, I don't think you ever have fisher that are just consistently out there focusing on any one given species.
We have some folks asking about the way they hunt, how they find their prey. Anything particular about their sight or their smell or their hearing? Yeah, well, they certainly have an acute sense of smell and good eyesight. I'm not sure what I could compare it to. I really don't know the, if you will, the statistics on their ability to detect things with their nose or what have you. I can tell you that they have a very unique foraging pattern, and it's often described as a zigzag pattern, and it's common of a lot of mustelids or members of the weasel family. That is, when they're hunting, if you look at their tracks going through a forest stand, it'll often have a very zigzag type pattern where they're just kind of randomly zigzagging through the forest hoping to come across something rather than a stalking type of hunting approach. Do they have like a den? Do they hang out in tree cavities, ground cavities?
Yep, they will utilize ground cavities as well as tree cavities. The females are only really consistently in a natal den, for that short period of the year, usually in early April or late March. And it's been suggested that females will often select dens high in the trees, that is cavities in trees, that have as small an opening as possible, and it's been suggested that they select that small opening to exclude male fisher from coming in to kill those kits. And because the male fisher has a much larger head if it's an adult male and possibly can't access the den. So I think most of the natal dens occur in trees, but certainly they will utilize holes in the ground to get out of the elements for short periods of time.
All right. Do they hibernate?
Nope, they don't hibernate at all. They're active and hunting virtually every day of the year due to their high metabolic demands.
All right. We have a couple folks asking what they should do if a fisher would attack their pet.
Yeah, that's a challenging question. It's unlikely to happen in the first place, although I mentioned we do get some complaints of fisher depredating particularly domestic cats or backyard poultry operations. If you would encounter that scene, I suggest that you're just yelling and vocalizing would probably drive the fisher off very quickly.
Sounds good. Rory is curious about the first-year survival rate.
Yeah, I don't think we have a very good handle on juvenile survival rates. It's probably, demographically, it's probably probably one of the most important, factors driving the high rate of increase or the growth of our fisher population. That is to suggest the juvenile survival rate's probably pretty high. I would suggest probably in the 50 to 60% range to see the type of growth that we've been seeing. We did look at juvenile survival in our bobcat population a few years back, and it's hopeful in the future that maybe we could do the same with our fisher population.
All right, and then let's see. Earl is curious about the purpose of the fisher reintroduction.
Well, the purpose of the fisher reintroduction, just like all of our reintroductions, is to try and restore native communities to what they were, prior to losses that occurred, again, in the late 1800s. We've had successful reintroduction efforts for beaver, for river otter, for fisher throughout the Commonwealth, and really the only species, the only fur bearer that we haven't restored to date, now that the fisher reintroduction is a success, is the pine marten. We also had pine marten that were lost during those same years. The challenge we find is that pine marten certainly are more of a habitat specialist, and it's questionable whether our habitats would support a pine marten population.
All right. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to everyone's questions today. There's still a pile over there, but we're pretty much out of time. So I want to invite those of you that would like to get those questions answered to email them to pgccomments@pa.gov and mention the Fisher webinar there in your the title of the email, and we'll do our best to see if we can get those answered. The session has been recorded, so you should receive an email with a link to the recording within the next few hours. The recording will also be uploaded to the Game Commission's YouTube channel within the next few days, and I'd like to thank Matt for sharing his expertise and time with us today. We'd also like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon, and hope you'll visit us again to learn more about Pennsylvania wildlife in upcoming webinars. Until then, we hope you're able to get outside and enjoy some of Pennsylvania's great outdoors.